So I think we've hit 4 o'clock. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy this afternoon's webinar. It's the 4th webinar that we've done so far as a team, and MKS F&M Fundraising and Management wanted to do something to give back to the sector at the moment, especially with coronavirus, just to be able to help people to think and also to share. We've been having a lot of conversations with leaders, and what we found over the last couple of weeks is that the conversations have moved from emergency and almost what are we going to do and panic to people now have got a direction that they're moving towards, and they're starting to implement, they're starting to make change happen, but they're doing so in a future that's just so uncertain. So we felt as a group, as a team, that talking about how to plan in this uncertain environment was just a really good thing to help you. The first thing is, I run a course, or I have been running a course for Cass Business School around building financial sustainability, reimagining organizations. And what we found is that people come from two, if you like, flavors. One is that people want to survive. So we're going to talk today about how in the short term, do we get people to survive and help themselves? But what we're really going to focus on is the much more long-term and the evolution potentially and the change that we think we're going to see in the charity sector. What we're going to do is we're going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, then we're going to open for questions. At this point in time, I'd normally ask people to notice where the fire exits are. Unfortunately, you're sat at home, but I hope you're getting more used to webinars. As I say, 30 to 40 minutes presentation, and then we'll open for questions. So what are we going to do in today's webinar? We're going to talk about a little bit about MKS. We're just going to go through that quickly, and then we're going to come to the heart of this, which is head and heart, money, versus social value. It's a constant issue, a constant thing for charities. And cutting to the heart of why we exist, let's explore this tension between money and impact. Carl's going to talk about how we evolve, how do we not just survive. He's going to talk about impact, profitability, the changing world. He's also going to talk about charities in a very dynamic environment. How do we become agile? Penny's then going to bring it all together, looking at a different way to plan. And also we're going to then open for questions. And then at the end, we've got one page, which is going to be on what's coming up next from MKS. I've got a couple of, people saying that they're having a difficulty with the sound. We had the same problem last time. Most people could hear, just one or two people couldn't. So either bear with us, we're recording this, and we'll put this out, yeah? I'm watching the comments as they come in, so I'm trying to do that in real time. A couple of things about Moore Kingston Smith before we kick into the actual webinar. 700 charity clients, 62 partners, in the UK, 14 charity specialist partners in the UK.
Nice so biscuit, please.
It's about 40% of our business. We've got offices throughout the world now as part of, Moore Global Network. In other words, we are very much focused on the charity sector. It's part of our fiber. And the team, which is MKS Fundraising and Management, is perfectly formed. It's a group of finance, fundraising, and impact specialists. And so with impact, we can really understand the change that we bring about, with non-profit organizations and charities. We can then underpin that with the fundraising, with strategic fundraising advice, writing proposals, and we're just launching a bid writing service to help. And then the final thing is good financial management, business model reviews, and cash flow scenario planning, for the future. Anyway, enough about MKS. I'm going to kick into the main part of our presentation. So here's the thing. What I do when I'm running courses, I quite often ask charities, are you really creating social value, or are you really all about money? And it's interesting because for the last, let's say 5-10 years when I've asked that question, the first reaction that I get from nonprofits and charities is we create social value or almost how dare you ask us about the money? Yeah. And it's interesting because as the conversation evolves, people get more comfortable with talking about the money, even so much to the extent that at the end of the conversation, if I was Jon Snow and I had my swingometer, the needle would be pointing towards the money rather than the social value. And so you're talking about head and heart. You're talking about we only exist for the change that we create in the world. And yet we've got to have the money to do that. And it's a tension that pulls organizations, yeah? And trying to hold this, and Stephen Lee, one of the lecturers at CAS, always talks about this alchemy, trying to get this alchemy right, where you're balancing off head and heart. It's really, really difficult, yeah? And with coronavirus, it's going to become even more difficult, I believe. When I was doing some research a couple of years ago, I looked at the motivation for charities to explore new models, new tools to change. And what I found was that actually charities were very comfortable in their skin. They were very comfortable with their reserve policies. Non-profits were very comfortable in the way that they were working. Even some of them that weren't, if you like, sustainable in the long term, just lacked the inertia, just had inertia and lacked the want to actually explore tools and different models. Trustees also had a stewardship mindset. They wanted to pass on the charity to the next group of trustees without making a change, without really, if you like, sort of challenging the status quo. And my question is, will coronavirus change this? I think it has to. I mean, will coronavirus change, the world in general, the corporate world, government? Of course it will. And charities will be part of that as well. So I firmly believe at the moment that we're in a space where we will have to fundamentally change. There will be change. And it's about how do we manage that, but keep at our heart, the top picture, dementia, keep at our heart the middle picture here, refugee camps and those people that we exist for and why we create social value. But my work that I've done in the past has really showed that, and this is a proper bit of research. I can give you the details, afterwards if you want. But it really shows that charities need stable and predictable income streams for their financial sustainability. It's interesting. They will, unless there are predictable income streams, they won't think about almost anything else. Well, some charities have very large reserves. That's slightly different. But a normal charity or a normal, non-profit would say, if we can't see the predictability of income streams, we're really going to worry about our survival and stability over impact. We're going to worry about that over quality. We're going to worry about that over growth. We're going to worry about that in terms of our infrastructure. And it really then comes back to people just thinking about survival rather than what we're doing to, to help the clients or beneficiaries that we work for. Now, here's the thing with coronavirus and COVID-19 and the changes we're going through. I believe we're going to be driven by money more than impact for such a long time and a significant time to come. So the big message from me today is we've got to get that balance right. So if you imagine this swing between the money and the impact, we've got to start to address that so we go back towards impact. So we start to really see beneficiaries and just not driven by the money. Yeah. And then we're going to talk about how that plays out in a planning cycle. So Carl, over to you, and then I'll be back later.
Mark has been talking about taking steps into a future world, and I thought I would just take a look at the world we live in right now. It's been very difficult days. There's some research at the weekend showed that something like 10% of adults questioned didn't want the world to go back to the way it was. So there is this issue for us about the place of charities in a financial world and what kind of new economy will emerge. You'll probably have noticed that rumbling underneath everything that we see on our screens night after night during lockdown is this idea that about to face such a downturn in the economy, and that's going to make things really difficult. And so, of course, the role of the charity sector coming forward will play a huge part in terms of meeting the needs that will emerge in some kind of new world. So charities will be in the front line of this crisis, but as Mark says, we'll need plans for sustainability going forward. There's the issue of how we deal with how we've dealt with the last 2 or 3 weeks, how we deal with the next few months, coming out of lockdown, for example, but also the sense that we still have to think about building for the future. If you like, we're here today and we're also here tomorrow. And this just gives us a feel really for the kind of economy we'll be in and how we will deal with it. The British PM gave a speech recently, actually on the 3rd of February, talking about the advantages in trade and so on. I don't know if he knew what was around the corner, because he proposed that in a situation where there might be a pandemic, certain things could happen in the trade world, and of course then it was immediately upon us. But in terms of thinking of the economy and where we go, there's definitely something that's going to be a real pressure, this balance between an economy that's working well and inequality and poverty increases. These are the things that a whole range of the charities that we work with are dealing with. So there's no doubt that we will be taking decisions around the balance between health and the well-being of the populace and restarting the economy. So where do charities sit in that? Well, a lot of what we're doing in our team is always talking about our various disciplines and how we think about finance and how we think about impact, and there's a real kind of interaction between those two. But a charity that doesn't manage resources well will lose the edge. And sort of when we think about maximizing impact, these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about. So we're going to be facing the economic downturn. What that means is that, charities, even in the last 2 or 3 weeks, have had to be really reactive. We were talking in our team this morning actually about how things have been forced upon us, things that in our world we would never have thought we needed to do so quickly. That has impacted on the charity sector as well. And it's quite clear that being lean as a group, being agile, for example, being able to turn things around very quickly is a really important aspect of what has been enabled charities to keep going. And those that will survive will be those that have that agility. I think it was Martin Drake who said in his blog, we were discussing it this morning, that no amount of cross-skilling within an organization, no amount of rapid action work among your workforce in a charity will go anywhere without CEOs and management actually being aware and reactive to that. And we were just saying also that the governance structure that we deal with in charities, unless that can be really tuned into what's happening, and unless decisions can be taken really quickly, so in other words, agility in decision making as well, then charities simply won't be in a position to survive. Just trying to move the slides on. So this tension that Mark mentioned, impact versus profitability, I'm thinking that really sometimes profitability isn't a word that sits comfortably with a lot of charities, but what we're really talking about here is the whole area of longer term social value. Now, we've mentioned this in the context of how, how we move forward. And it's often the case that, we feel that there's a tension between what we do today and the longer term social value we create. So when we think about, should we focus on money and income, these things versus, the public good that we do, we're always having to think, how do we go about measuring some of this? And this is where impact really comes in. At MKS, we use an impact mechanism that is not, it's not reinventing the wheel. It does involve us thinking about inputs and our resources. It does involve us thinking about running our activities as efficiently as possible. But you will not be in a position to do any of these things unless you're actually tracking outcomes. And it's when you track outcomes that you're then in a position to, account for the way that you move forward. Impact is such a necessary commodity in terms of being able to show the social value you're creating. But we are really talking about the tension between that and whether we focus on income. And we all know the problems that charities have faced in terms of mission drift when we just follow the money. But recently we did a piece of work at MKS where we came up with a kind of a mechanism here that allowed us to think of the implications of both pushing for impact and looking at the whole area of activities that would generate a surplus. And this essentially is about getting the balance absolutely right. And it's very difficult to do. It's easier said than done. But the top left-hand quadrant, for example, that's in a sense, where you have a fair bit of impact, but there isn't a lot of income coming in. And that's, one of those things then that you have to decide, how do you take things forward? The bottom left-hand one, well, this should be easy enough, you would have thought, but how many of us know charities that carry on doing what they have always done, maybe because there's a staffing structure to reinforce that process. But where your activities fall into this lower left quadrant, you really need to be thinking about stopping that activity. The lower right quadrant, that's a different one altogether. And this is the scenario in which you have good income, some surplus, but the impact is poor. And really the strategic issue here is whether or not you continue this activity because the surplus can fund some of the other things. But of course, the top right-hand quadrant is the blend or the sweet spot, as we say, where the activity is both impactful and providing you with some surplus, some profitability, some income. The whole point of all this is that in actual fact, a lot of your activities can fall into these different areas. But Mark has got some really insightful examples, I think, of some of the kinds of experiences of charities that fall into some of these different areas. And he's going to talk a bit about that right now. You're muted, Mark.
You know when you're muted and suddenly you're speaking and nobody is listening or nobody can hear you. Anyway, I'm so sorry. Back to this grid. What I'm going to try and do is bring it to life, because what we've, as Carl says, we've now done a number of different projects where we've used this methodology and it's helped organizations plan. And also on the side, what we're numbers, but I just want to talk you through on the next two slides how it works, just so we can bring this to life. So the first thing is if we look in the bottom left, ability to generate surplus, or I'm going to low profitability. Portion your overhead down in the here, and for example, it doesn't really create any impact. And it was a making. And somebody said back to me, oh, and so when we said, well, can we just take a decision around the table now to just stop doing this? Yeah.
Sorry, is it just me, Peter Gotham here, or have you got a very poor connection there, Mark?
No, it's me as well, actually.
Yeah, Mark, have a go at turning your camera off and just go with the audio, and we might be able to see, it might be a bit clearer. And could you start again with the slide, because we didn't hear most of that. Mark, are you there? Not there. Okay. Carl, would you be happy to maybe pick up? Oh, is he back?
The joys of being in a rural location. It's Marcus here. I'm happy to take over for this slide if you want. So, as Mark was saying, at the top left there, you've got those organizations where those services, sorry, where you're maybe getting a high impact, but you're not generating a surplus on top of that. And oh, we might have Mark back with us. Mark, are you there?
Go ahead, Marcus.
Sure. So where you have those services where you're having a high impact but potentially not generating a surplus, or to use the P word, profit, it's about trying to think, okay, how can we either keep our costs down, or really crucially in this area, look at improving your cost recovery. So trying to better cost your service to move as much of that cost above the line out of your overheads to get it funded as possible. And services such as this may be funded by services that you've got down at the bottom right, where you've got a high surplus generating potential but a low impact. And so trying to find that balance between your services of saying, okay, we have this impactful service here, but it doesn't generate us any revenue or any surplus. But we also have another service over here that is maybe not as impactful, but this is what is able enables us to fund maybe those more impactful services that we have. And at the top right, obviously, you've got those services that have a high impact and also generate a good surplus to the organization. And this is where you want to be trying to move as many of your services as possible. And then at the bottom left, we've got those services where you're not making a surplus and you're not able to generate maybe as much impact as some of your other services. And this is about trying to really challenge yourselves and challenge your organizations to say, okay, let's review our services. Where on this particular diagram do our services sit? Do we have a lot of our services sitting on the left side? So low profitability. Do we have a lot of our services sitting in the bottom half? So having a low impact. Do we need to be changing our services, changing what we're doing to try and move as much as we can towards the right and the top of this diagram. And so here we have an example of, this is for an elderly charity working with older people. And so you can see here some of the different ones. So at the very top right, a personal shopper service, incredibly impactful for those people that you're working with, and also able to generate a surplus there for the rest of the organization. But the size of the circles there is also looking at their reach. So you can see there it's a very impactful and surplus generating service, but it is maybe not as profitable, as wide-reaching as something like the Help at Home service, which reaches far more people but is a less profitable one. And it looks like Mark is potentially back. He was just messaging me to say he's back if he wants to pick back up. If not, I will just keep going until he cuts me off. So at the bottom you can see there fundraising, a highly profitable, but it's not necessarily an impactful service. And so putting your different services in there can really be a good way of seeing a holistic view of the organization as a whole, and being able to really challenge yourselves as to, okay, where do our services really sit on this diagram, and do we need to address them and to change what we're doing with some of these to make sure that that we are being as impactful as possible, but also hopefully generating some form of surplus to make ourselves sustainable organizations for the future.
Hi guys.
And now Mark is back. Perfect timing.
Hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Mark.
Yeah, great. I'm just gonna take you back to this slide very quickly. I know I've been watching the emails. I've just not been able to respond, so I'm sorry. I'm going to take you back to the slide, and just a couple of things, about the slide, because as I said, Marcus has taken you through it, but I want to bring this to life. When you're in the low impact, low profit area, and for example, you can't stop things. Sometimes you actually have to make a must-do list. I mean, it can be really helpful for an organization to turn it around. In other words, rather than the things that we've always done, how do we turn it around to the things that we're actually going to put our money and our time and our energy behind, and see that actually there's an opportunity cost? So this low impact, low profit can hold you back in other ways. And as I said, I was talking about a homeless charity that was making jam. Nobody particularly enjoyed, the service. The jam wasn't particularly strong. It was made by, volunteers, and the volunteer force was hard to manage. And when we, as a group of consultants, said, "Look, just stop making the jam, stop that service," somebody said, "It's the way we've always done things." And so when we said, "You can stop it, you can take that decision," people were actually quite relieved that we were able to say, no. But on the flip side, equally, sometimes it's hard for people to see that actually it's rational to stop things. And they might have invested time, energy, and their life behind that. That's a very difficult balance. Where you've got the top left-hand corner, which is high impact and low profitability, for example, you might be doing something, I don't know, which is actually creating services, for example, a toilet block in the developing world or a low-income country. And if you actually just have a grant and you build it and you give it to the community, it will be broken pretty quickly, typically. If you allow people to have a job to build it, if you actually give people a work so that they can sell condoms and things from that, if people charge a small amount of money to actually access those services, it'll be there for 6 months to a year to 10 years, because people care about it in the community and they've actually put their soul into that. So actually moving the business model, if you see, from being something you give them, a community, a toilet block, to a community where they actually are involved in its construction is really powerful. The difficult one is where you have high profit, and low impact. It can really tear organizations apart. I've always been really interested in Mary Stopes' solution to this, where they have a separate organization called Options that does contracts and profit, and it's a it's a profit-making organization versus the charitable entity, Mary Stopes, which is much more philanthropic, much more charitable. But of course, what we're trying to do is to get into the high impact, high profitability. And the interesting thing there is you can't then just stop. You have to keep managing and investing and evolving that. And CC3 says to trustees that they must also be generative. They have to come up with new ideas to help the beneficiaries and the people that we serve. So I just wanted to play that out. Marcus has talked about the next grid, so I'm going to hand back to Carl now.
Striving for sustainability, and maybe we should entitle this slide "Dynamic Charities in a Dynamic World." But I wanted to bring your attention just briefly to this report because we want to leave a bit of time this afternoon for discussion and questions that you might have. But this report was produced jointly by Barclays and the Cass Business School. And what it really was about, it was a series of roundtable debates at different regional venues a year or two back. And the idea here was that they were asking charities to really ask the big questions. So, in terms of thinking about the future, are you clearly focused on core purpose, for example? Is your development strategic and sustainable, not just growth for its own sake? Because we often just carry on doing the things we've done, as Mark has said. Are you prepared to ditch what isn't working? Again, it's a kind of theme that's repeating itself in this webinar. But Mark Solway, who's been speaking today, he actually wrote this report based on the work of these different meetings, and they've produced I think it's an absolutely lovely little graphic here, which is really essentially about looking at the key things that have come about as a result of those discussions. I'm just trying to move this on to the next slide, and it's not playing ball, but there it is. Yeah, this is part of the report. You'll see on the previous slide there was a link to it that's been provided, and you can have a look. But the 5 or 6 areas are shown in the middle there. They were looking at collaboration, sustainability, efficiency, things like use of reserves and innovation. I just wanted to pull out a few of the themes. But you can see for yourself here, there's lovely little illustrations for each of these, but these are the things that charities should really be thinking about when they think about sustainability into the future. So things under collaboration that kind of jumped out at me was, considering collaboration as a key part of the strategy. So what can new relationships add? I worked with a charity a year or two back. They were so focused and so plugged into seeing potential partners as actually the competition, and we're often drawn into that, often because of the way that funding is arranged and so on. But should collaboration and a different approach to that be a key part of your strategy? Under sustainability, I like that illustration of balancing today's needs with those of the future. That's pretty relevant to today, where we don't know actually what the world will look like in 6 months' time. We think it'll return to normal, but we started off the webinar by saying, actually, we think there has to be change, and surely this experience we've all been through across the world, actually, practically speaking, surely that will bring about different ways of thinking. The efficiency one, the one I pulled out there was just maximizing outputs against the resources. Well, against resources you have access to, I suppose. Efficiency is not a word that we always take to in the charitable sector, because maybe it smacks of being businesslike or something, and yet those things, we've learned that those things aren't mutually exclusive. But the whole point here is to make sure that if you're thinking about impact and you're thinking about tracking outcomes that result from your outputs, it's really important that you carry out your activities in a very efficient way. Use of reserves. Carefully consider innovation and impact when setting reserve levels. So this is the whole thing of thinking about the future and what might be around the corner, and when again you might have to innovate for something that has been as so impactful as the experience we're all still going through. And finally, this innovation and scalability. Developing a platform for scalable solutions in the long term. I really like the illustration on this because it's actually showing us something around growing something small, controlling and monitoring, how it's developing, and then move on to something bigger, make it scalable, make it safe in terms of stepping up. We've learned lots of lessons around charities growing too fast, growing for the sake of it, and then becoming unwieldy and getting out of control. So by all means use the link. I think there's great little lessons in here just in terms of these different areas, and you're welcome to have a look at that and just see if if there's anything there that you can find helpful. Anyway, that's enough from me for now. I'm going to hand over to Penny, who's going to wrap up for us in terms of thinking about planning for the future.
Hi everyone. I thought I'd have a go at popping my video on so we can have another face in. But if my connection's poor, just somebody drop me a note and I'll turn the video off and just go to audio. So yes, I'm just going to spend a couple of slides, bring it all together, and everything that we've heard today and the tools that we've seen. How can we use this to plan a new way for the future, and this future that we know is really quite uncertain at the moment, but we're going forward into it. So the diagram on this slide, I really like it. It's nice and simple, and you can see the arrow is taking us towards this new plan. And so how do we make decisions? How do we plan? And how do we put together an impact-focused strategy? So impact being this word that you've heard many times in this presentation, but you would have heard many times anyway. Is really sort of stage one and step one, and we really sort of want to say or encourage you to keep that at the heart of what you're doing. And we are purpose-driven organizations. The reason why we exist is to create change in the world. That's why charities were born in the first place. And so to not lose sight of that and to keep that at the center of your decision making. A few years ago, I started a small not-for-profit back in my home country in South Africa. And of course, I started it, as most charities are started, because I had a mission that I wanted to create a difference in the world. But very quickly, upon having the concept of the idea and getting it going, I was hit with fears and lots of people on my board, etc., asking around, how is this going to make money? And so I really understand, as we all do, and we've all worked in charities, that challenge of keeping the balance between, staying focused on your impact and obviously the need for being financially sustainable, which leads me nicely onto step 2, which is about understanding your finances and your funding models, and of course the fundraising potential of your activities. When you're making decisions, you really need to have that financial management information, and this is of course a really crucial part of your business plan. And if we're fundraising, understanding what are we fundraising for? Is it for our services? Is it for our overheads? Or is it for a blend of that? And then step 3 is something we haven't addressed, but it's kind of common sense in a way, but something important to remember throughout is asking the question, the really important question of, can all of this be implemented? So, you know, what are the practicalities of the changes that you want to implement, or the new activities, or the activities that you want to adapt, your new business plan? What is this practical in the world? And of course, with coronavirus, the world is a strange place at the moment. So, you know, internally, what are your practicalities? Do you have the sort of resources? Do you have the experience? Do you have the expertise? And obviously externally, what does it look like, and how can you deliver that? And as we move through, you know, over the next few months, and we move through into the future, and that's what we're looking at, how do we plan for this future? That's going to be changing all the time. The ground beneath us is going to be changing in terms of what's possible and what's practical and what's not. So keeping, you know, keeping aware of that, and then we may need to sort of loop back and relook at those changes when the possibility and the practicality landscape changes. So this sort of drives us towards this new plan for the future, and looking at new plans. And I think what's important to mention at this point as well is sort of to couch this within a culture of change. And we really just want to, you know, encourage charities. Charities are doing, you know, you're all doing incredible work out there. And we've mentioned, both Mark and Carl has mentioned, that it's not always easy to change and have a culture of change. Changing the way you do things, changing your ideas, changing activities themselves, stopping activities. It's not easy, and change, I sort of think of it as a bit of a muscle. It's something that we almost need to practice to be good at it, and we've certainly all been thrown in the deep end. And so to keep within your teams, encouraging that and cultivating that culture of change, which is so important to carry us through. So finally, I'll just say a couple more things, and then I'm going to pass back over to Mark. And Carl's mentioned this sort of well-known phrase, and we sort of like to deconstruct it, really, disassemble it. Here today, gone tomorrow. We're going to rebuild that into here today, here tomorrow for charities, because, you know, we know that charities are doing critical work at the moment, and in the future are going to be needed sort of more than ever. And so the future, how do we move from survival into evolution, and not just survive as organizations, but actually thrive as organizations? So, you know, the key question that's been running through the whole webinar, hopefully you can take away with you, is what do you think about what do charities think about when they plan for the future? Maybe looking back at what you have thought about when you've planned for the future, and now moving forward, what are you going to think about when you plan for the future? We want to focus on impact, keep the main thing, and just a couple of last thoughts around that and impact, and Carl touched on it, you know, is if impact's going to be driving our planning and our discussions, which is really important, it's important then for us to keep a finger on the pulse in terms of what is the impact, and to have some sort of understanding and of what impact your activities are generating, what is the social value. So that means sort of keeping abreast of some impact data and keeping that coming in, because you're going to need that to make those decisions. And of course, you know, I've mentioned this in a webinar previously, so apologies to those who've heard it, but now's not the time necessarily to launch a full social return on investment or impact analysis, but definitely making sure that you're keeping that impact data coming in, so you have a good idea of the impact of your services, so you're then able to make those decisions and for it to inform your plan moving forward. So that's all from me for the moment. And Mark, if you are back online, hopefully your audio is okay and I can hand over back to you. Great.
So that's the end of the presentation. And Carl and Penny, thank you. And also, just to, if you kind of like frame the final thing from me, if you look at money on one side and you look at impact on the other side, we've got to get the balance right, is what we're really saying. I mean, Heather open the questions has given us quite a few thoughts. I mean, you know, Heather, I'm reading down through what you're saying, and now this is now open for anybody to actually write into the chat box, and we'll try and have a conversation. So I'm inviting, you know, Penny and Carl back on so that we have a panel and we can answer questions and have a bit of a conversation. I'm hearing you, Heather. You know, what you're saying is it just feels so, you know, difficult at the moment. There are so many uncertainties, it feels almost impossible. And then she says, we don't know how our beneficiaries will engage at the end of this. Absolutely right, but you have to ask them. Yeah. So what Penny and Carl, you know, spend their time focused on is stakeholders and asking people what they're really getting. And so I know from my work before, it's going to have to be very agile, the future. It's going to have to be, you try something, you fail fast, you move, you listen to the information around you and you plot a new course. Yeah. And Heather, you're saying it's very difficult to keep the wheels on the wagon at the same time as planning for the future. I totally agree. I mean, keeping the wheels on the wagon and then finding a small amount of time to actually think, you know, maybe even giving a group of the trustees and management the chance to think about what evolution looks like, and using our template here. You know, we're saying, think about the impact, think about the finance, think about the role of fundraising, and can it be implemented? This, if you like, Heather, is the final part of, is there a good recovery plan template? Well, I haven't seen one, but this is the model we would base it around, having done work with Age UK and YCare in terms of building their new strategies around, you know, impact. Carl, Penny, I mean, you know, if I pick up Claire 12 Trees question, and then we'll just dive in from there. Isn't income secondary to impact? Is it an enabler? First and foremost, charities need to be mission driven and understand how they deliver impact and then how much that costs. The problem is sometimes you need an infrastructure and a core capacity to be able to deliver. If you don't have the money to do that, you'll just drop back into a survival mode, Claire. So it's important that we make sure that we have the money, but without sustainable income streams, as I said at the start, we just fall back into thinking about nothing other than money. It's very interesting how some charities are really money driven. And you know, I think sometimes actually, like sort of placing, for example, a person, you know, at the heart of discussions and talking about that person's needs can really make it personal, can bring impact back into the equation. Why don't you go next, Carl? Have you got a question you'd like to answer, and somebody who's written a comment? And everybody, please write comments, because otherwise this is a little bit boring from our end. But please keep the comments coming.
I can't see them, Mark. I can't see the questions. So if you can pick one out.
So, Carl, Lloyd asks, many charities are struggling, and we know some are likely to fail without support. What are your views on partnership or mergers as an opportunity, and how might the risks and costs be mitigated? So something about partnership, and then something about merger. Why don't you take that question?
I think you know, partnerships are you know, a real advantage if you sit down carefully and discuss the anatomy of the partnership and who's doing what and how it'll come about. It's I've had a lot of experience. You'll tell by my accent. I've had a lot of experience in working with people, charities in Northern Ireland, but also people who are working with ex-combatants, who really had to look at how they would get together across communities. And a big driver in that was thinking about the impact that they could achieve together. Each had to go back into its own constituency and you know, work with that group to bring them forward before they could, you know, cross the threshold of cooperation, if you like. But partnerships can work very well because actually it often can do away with the competitional mode that we're so often driven to in the charitable sector. And in terms of mergers, that can be a more difficult relationship in my experience, because very often charities merging have a situation where perhaps there's duplication and there needs to be changes in approach to resourcing future work. And that can be a difficult situation for some individuals. But essentially, these things are worth doing if the impact at the end of it is bigger than the sum of the two parts, if you like.
So Carl, there's another question here, or Penny. Would you recommend trying to measure impact or focus on outcomes?
It's an interesting question. And what do we mean by the difference? I would say that in the situation we're in right now, I would focus on measuring outcomes, tracking outcomes, and being able to link those outcomes to the work that you're doing. Very often impact reports ignore things like the counterfactual, where people don't take account of other influences that have created an outcome. But if you can track an outcome, then the whole thing of valuing that outcome to get to some monetary expression of impact is probably not the kind of ball game you're going to be particularly interested in the situation we're in right now. But it's ironic, isn't it, that when we talk about the balance between impact and money, actually very often impact is expressed through a monetization process. So we can't always escape it. But the short answer to your question, if you did choose between the two in terms of resources, I would say the greatest advantage to you is to be very clear of the causal link between what it is you do and the outcomes, and therefore the change that you create.
I mean, Adrienne Arthurs, it's interesting, and I'm going to bring Penny in at the end of this here. Adrienne is saying outcomes and impact are affected by this time. How do we sell that to funders, where it's traditionally data-driven and our numbers have fallen temporarily? I mean, this is my own view. I mean, Penny, I'll bring you in. Carl, please. I think that we worry sometimes too much about the volume of delivery. Sometimes actually donors are just happy that you are keeping a service going. I mean, I worked for the Ethnic Minority Foundation. We had to go back and renegotiate 19 contracts to get the organization to survive. And you know what? They were just pleased that we kept going and kept trying. I think where you have a fund off, a fall off in terms of the number of people that you're helping at the moment, donors are going to understand that. And so my view is just to talk to them. I mean, Penny or Carl, do you have anything to add to that comment at all?
Hi, Carl. Sorry, I can't see the question. Would you mind repeating it again?
Yeah. So the comment was, how do funders feel now that the volume of work that we're doing has dropped away? In other words, we're being measured on our outcomes, but the volume of those outputs and outcomes are dropping. How do you think donors will respond?
So, I mean, it'll be interesting to hear Carl's point of view on that, but I think, yeah, I would tend to agree with you, Mark, in terms of number one is talking to your funders and having open, honest conversations. From what I've heard and from what we've spoken about as our team and have spoken to a few clients in different charities, funders are being incredibly sympathetic at the moment. They really understand. And of course, the volume of the work has dropped at the moment, but that's something, that is a product of external, the external environment that we find ourselves in. So I would sort of reiterate what you've said, Mark. I don't know, Carl, if you've got any further thoughts on that as well.
No, I don't really. I think the situation that funders are in is very peculiar at the moment, and we all know that. But my experience of funders in more normal times is that they want more and more to know something about the evidence for the change that you're creating. And that will be important when we see light at the end of the tunnel and we come out of all this. That earlier point that someone made about keep the data flow going around being able to inform the evidence of what it is you're claiming to change through your work.
So there's a very good comment moving on to something slightly different from Celine Jerem, who says managing a hospice charity this period could change the relationship with statutory service. This holds potential benefits and risk and a fundamental change in culture around end of life. This will be a challenge we will need to consider as much remains an unknown. And you know, therein lies so many different things around your stakeholders. Because if you're looking at your different stakeholders, you've got, you know, the general public that will have a different attitude potentially towards death and dying. You will have, you know, the hospice charity sector that will feel different going into this than coming out. And then you'll have those statutory services that are supporting, you know, potentially hospices in the way that they haven't done before. You know, because hospices have been so heavily funded by fundraising in the past. So, as you say, I think that the risk appetite of organisations and specifically trustees will be critical in the period ahead. Yeah. How do we take the right decisions to safeguard organisations, but also invest in the future and invest in those relationships to do the right things for those that we exist for? Yeah, and the hospice users in your case. I think this is really interesting, and also playing out some what ifs, playing out some scenarios, understanding those stakeholder dynamics is really important. I mean, you know, back to the impact team. I mean, what about engaging with stakeholders at the moment? What are your views there, especially as you've got online engagement as well to think of in the mix?
Yeah, it's obviously more difficult at the moment. An awful lot of the quality of engagement is when you're talking to people and you've verbal as well as non-verbal cues all as part of that communication. So that's the beauty and often the advantage of, say, focus group work. But we have to deal with the art of the possible. And I know Penny, for example, even today has been engaged in some stakeholder engagement, even in the last few days, where we just have to make do with telephone communication. And maybe it is the case that you have to have a very sympathetic kind of approach in a telephone interview, where you maybe have to check out perhaps 2 or 3 times what's intended, what is meant. But it is still possible to do it. It's all about having that right approach and maybe being really economical with the kinds of things you're talking about and asking about. And in the impact world for us, that's about what is your experience? What changes do you feel you're going through? Can you articulate that for us in some way, and how would you value it? Those things can still be done by telephone, but there's no doubt that the human connection is really important when you're gathering stakeholder data.
I'm going to just make 2 very quick comments and then just wrap up with the final slide. I'm sorry. Thank you everybody for you know, all of the comments that have come through on text. Claire 12 Trees, very smart comment just to finish off with. Should we be aiming for shorter time plans to plan over, i.e. 2 to 3 years? I've always believed that charities shouldn't plan for 5 or 10 years unless you're building infrastructure, because actually the world is moving so quickly. I think 2 or 3 years time span, certainly in the coronavirus world, is all you should be planning. It's moving so fast. And then testing that quarterly, absolutely. And then the final one, Carl Richardson, there's a number of questions about fundraising. And this is where I'm going to, Carl, I'm going to let my colleague, Dan, be in contact with you outside of the meeting here. And we are going to be holding the next webinar on, I think it's on the 3rd of April. Anyway, next Wednesday. The conversation is going to be about fundraising. You can ask the questions that you want there. There's lots of events coming up. So you've got the final slide here. There's lots of events coming up. The next webinar isn't the 23rd of April. That's today. We'll drop you a message about the next webinar. Our services, bid writing, cost recovery, impact engagement, fundraising support. If you're interested, we have a COVID-19 service catalog you can dip into and see what might be useful. And then regular articles are coming out. Watch the space. The final thing is we do offer 30-minute clinic slots. If you just want to come and talk to us and you just need some help now, feel free, come to the team. 1 minute over with those. 1 minute over. I do apologize. I just want to thank everybody for bearing with us. Have a